Hello everyone, and welcome to today's class on surface grading tips for Civil 3D. I am Brian Levendowski. I am the product manager at CTC Software, and CTC is a company based out of Minnesota. We make software solutions that run within Civil 3D and Revit and other platforms. So what we have on the agenda today, we're going to talk through some grading concepts. Then we're going to get into some pond or berm grading, some of those concepts, some more complex grading with parking lots, and then some miscellaneous features that you'll run into across every site and every project you work with. So the tools we're going to use, we're going to be using primarily feature lines as break lines, and I'll talk about why we're going to use those over some of the other tools. We're using surfaces, of course, but those are going to be more a byproduct of our feature lines. And what we're not using, for a variety of reasons, first one is grading tools. These I found to be very unstable, as maybe some of you have as well. Corridors, they're very powerful tools, but they're pretty inflexible when it comes to site grading like this. They're great for road design and so forth, but kind of inflexible in a site design scenario. 3D polylines, everything a feature line can do, or everything a 3D polyline can do, a feature line can do, and better, so no reason to use those. Polyline contours, it's a very time-consuming, limiting way to grade. There are better ways. And finally, focal points, same thing again, time-consuming, very clumsy. While they are flexible, because it's point-by-point grading, it's just not very efficient. A little more on some of the feature line tools we're going to use. With elevation editing, we're going to be using the Quick Elevation Edit tool. This should be one of your most common tools you use. It allows you to edit a single vertex or segment. The elevation editor, this should be reserved more for mass editing. It gives you a long list of all the vertices in a feature line, allows you to edit them, yes, one at a time, but it's kind of hard to understand where you are. I see a lot of people using this for point-by-point grading. You should use the Quick Elevation Editor instead. Elevations from surface, this is a way where we can read elevations from a surface into the vertices of a feature line. And one other common one, set grade between points. We can pick 2 points on a feature line, and it'll set a constant grade between those 2 points, adjusting the elevations for the vertices on all the intermediate points. And then on the geometry side, how are we creating things? We're going to be using the stepped offset command that's in the Edit Geometry panel. Then I'm going to show you a secondary utility as well called AutoGrader that'll allow you to automate some of that. And of course on the geometry side, and we're going to skip over some of this, but there's just the initial drafting of our site layout, and that you would be doing with 2D polylines. So we're going to jump into this assuming some of that has been done already. And we're going to take polylines and turn them into objects we can grade with. So some site grading concepts. I always think in terms of components. I've got a pond over here, a parking lot, a berm, whatever it might be, or maybe it's a residential scenario. Break up your site into different pieces. Try to keep things dynamic, and I'll show you some ways to do this using things like feature line style hierarchy, an ability to make a feature line relative to a surface, basically linked to a surface. Sometimes that can get you in trouble. There's places to use it and places not. I'll show you that today. And for today's exercise, we're going to keep everything in one surface. I know there's a number of workflows out there for creating separate surfaces for all your different components. We're going to create it all in one, and you'll see why we're going to do that. And finally, after you've graded out those components, then tie things together after the fact. Right? A spillway from a parking lot into a pond, tying into an existing curb line, something like that. All those kind of tie-in components. Do the primary grading first. So when it comes to pond or berm grading, what we're going to do is we're going to start with a high water or a top of pond line. And then we're going to create stepped offsets for benches and slopes along that. Okay, very simple tools, and I'll show you those in action for those of you who this is pretty new for. We can move a set of feature lines up or down as needed if it's not at the right location. And then we'll create a top of pond capacity surface and then a pond capacity volume surface so we can understand the capacity of our pond itself. When it comes to some of the parking lot grading, we're going to use a concept called a setup surface to establish a drainage pattern for our parking lot. This is a very powerful tool set that allows you to assign a lot of elevations, at least a preliminary set of them, to all the different vertices across your parking lot. Parking lot grading can be one of the most complex things to do, and it can eat up a lot of time. And so this is a concept that helps you get a preliminary grading concept before you might get into more fine-tuning. And with that, we're going to create flow line feature lines or gutter line feature lines, and we're going to link those to the setup surface. And then we're going to create offsets for the top and the back and the flange or the lip of the curb. And then we can make grading adjustments through the setup surface, and that will push to our flow line, and then we can adjust our top, back, and flange feature lines from there. Or you can make manual edits at that stage as well. And if time permits, we can run a slope analysis so we can understand if we've got areas that are too flat or too steep and we need to adjust them in our parking lot. And then finally, some of the miscellaneous features we'll look at. Building grading, how would you handle that? Perhaps a little concrete pad, and then tying into existing. So with that, I'm going to jump into Civil 3D, and we're going to walk through some of this. We're going to start with that pond because it's a fairly simple concept. And one of the things I like to do is to start with a polyline to define the horizontal geometry. So I'm going to freehand this in, and what I like to do is I start here, and then I run the arc command, okay, and then I run second point. It prompts me for the second point of my arc, and what it does is it puts me into this arc drawing mode where if you want kind of a more artistic free-handed pond shape, you can do that in this way. So it takes a little getting used to, but it's a really handy technique for drawing kind of free-handed shapes like this. And we don't want to use a spline in this way because those are very inflexible. There we go. Run a close on it. Okay, so that's just a basic 2D polyline. Now from there, we're going to turn this into a feature line. Now there is a create feature line command here. We could have drawn a feature line freehand. It's just not as flexible and as user-friendly as drawing by Polyline. So I like to do that many times. So we're going to run the create feature lines from objects, and I'm going to pick this here. This is going to represent my top of pond. Okay, we're going to use sites off and on through this class. Sites are something that you don't see on screen, but they're instead a container. And if two feature lines reside in the same site and they cross, they have to assume the same elevations. Okay, we'll show how that's will be used. For right now, we're going to put it in our standard building site. Next thing I have here are my styles. I'm going to take the default here, but we'll get into that, some more of that in a bit. One thing I like to do with my feature line styles, though, is I use them to control their behavior with one another, but not the appearance. So if I jump into this style called parent, you'll notice on the display tab, there's no layers assigned and everything is by layer. And when you do that, what happens is that the color and the line type and everything, they get passed to the object layer. And so I actually like to use this selected entity layer, and then I let the actual object layer control the line type and the color. So we'll do selected entity layer. And then some of the conversion options, we're going to erase existing utilities and assign elevations. And now it prompts me for some elevation options. We can assign a flat elevation, but what I like to do is I start from elevations from existing surface, so I have kind of a ballpark of where things sit. So I'm going to do existing. I'm not going to insert intermediate points. This would add additional points at every surface triangle crossing. And in this, we're going to use this a little bit later, but it would force the feature line to basically stick to the surface. I want to read elevations one time and then edit them from there. And so with that way, I'll uncheck both of these. So I'll hit OK. And now if I pick on this feature line, I get my contextual editing ribbon up here. Notice it's on that pond layer, so it's taking on the color of that even though it has a style assigned. And now it's up in elevation near my existing feature lines. Now to start this out, I like to launch the elevation editor. This is that tool I mentioned in the PowerPoint. It gives me a list of all of the vertices in my feature line. Now it's kind of a handy tool because you can access every one of them, but the problem is that it's a list by stationing, which is not something you're normally concerned with. And so I like to use this for more mass editing, where I come in here and I do a Control-A, and if we look at the elevations, we can kind of take a starting point. Let's go 831 for a starting elevation. You hit enter and it assigns those to every point on the pond. Okay, so mass editing, that's what the elevation editor is great for. Now that's our top of pond. We're now going to run stepped offsets, and when we complete that, we'll add this stuff into the surface and we'll see our contours and surface coming to life. Okay, picking on the feature line again, and I do this a lot. I like to use the contextual ribbon. It's really handy with feature lines. You have to make sure to expand these panels right over here to get access to the geometry and the elevation editing tools. And the tool we're after right here is the stepped offset command. I'm going to specify a distance. It's prompting me in the command line. I'm going to go a distance of, let's say, 7 feet. The side is going to be, I'm going to click to the inside. Then the elevation difference, I don't want to do that. I want to do a slope. So I can click slope down here and then enter -3 for -3 to 1. Okay, so slope is 3 to 1 or a ratio type format. Grade, and that's another option down here, that's a percent format. I hit enter and it offsets, and then in 3D view you can see that being lower than the top of pond. Okay, now pick the inner feature line, click this again, and we're going to do an offset of 2 feet, and we're going to click to the inside, and this time we'll do a grade of -10, so that's -10%, whereas before I did a -3 to 1. And so that's a bit of a bench there to control erosion. And now if I pick that inner one there, I run a stepped offset again. This time we'll go 7 feet again. I'm going to go to the inside and we'll go a slope of -3 to 1. Okay. It's as simple as that to create your feature lines. Okay. You can run stepped offsets in this way. It works great. It's easy for ponds. Now, some of you might be thinking, why wouldn't you use the grading tools? They do a similar thing. They're really handy, in fact. But again, they're pretty unstable. I found in the long run, you're better off with just using feature lines. Now, from here, we can take this entire set of feature lines. We can raise or lower it by a positive or negative amount. It's very easy to move it around. I can run a simple AutoCAD move command if it's too close to the parking lot. Okay. But once you have some preliminary grades, go ahead and take those feature lines and add them into a surface. So I have a surface created in here already. It's called the FG surface, and it's just empty right now. There's nothing in it. So I like to use the right-click command here. It's very handy. Add surface to break lines. We're going to add it to the FG surface. I'm going to hit OK. Okay. So break lines and surfaces, they're made from our feature lines. This is the most common workflow. Yes, you can use other objects like polylines, things like that, but when it comes to proposed grading like this, feature lines are what we use to create our break lines. I always give it a little description so you can make sense of your surface definition. We'll look into that a little bit later on. The type is going to be standard. And then down here I've got some supplementing factors. This is one of the key areas to understand about how to create nice looking surfaces. I'm going to set this to what would have been default, which is no distance supplementing and a mid-ordinate of 1 foot. I'm going to hit OK, and we'll take a look at our surface. In fact, I'm going to set the surface style so that it shows triangles. You always want a set of styles in here to give you different views of your surface so you can understand what's going on. And we can see this in 3D. We can also see it in 2D here. My contours don't look very nice. They're kind of jagged, right? And if you can see those triangle lines, you can see that those are contributing to it. In fact, if I zoom over here, you can kind of see here's that curved break line or feature line, but this is how the surface is interpreting it. It's like chording across there, okay? Those supplementing factors are key to getting the right balance of surface detail. So what you have to do is you have to go back into your surface properties, go to the definition tab, and here's why we want to make sure to name these things appropriately, so that if we need to remove the break lines and add them back in to perhaps change a break line setting, it's very easy to do. So remove definition, hit OK. I hit OK again. It's going to prompt me to rebuild the surface, and now I'm just back to the feature lines and an empty surface. Okay, I'm going to pick add to surface as break lines. I'm going to do FG. I'm going to call it pond again, and now I'm going to set some supplementing factors here. Now what do these do? The distance, what this does is it forces extra triangulation on straight segments. I don't have a lot of those in here. In fact, I don't have any of them, so that won't apply here. Okay, but if you do, it'll force triangulation at least every 20 feet along that straight segment. It's always going to triangulate where you have a vertex, like a PC or something right here, but say in this parking lot we had a straight grade from here all the way to here. To get nice looking contours, you want triangulation to connect along that feature line. So you would dial that up. What's great in a detailed site grading, something like 10 feet, 15 feet, kind of find a balance there. Mid-ordinate has to do with the triangulation along curves. Basically, the lower the value, the more triangulation you get. 0.1 or 0.2 is pretty nice in detailed site grading. So I'm going to hit OK, and what we're going to see is a much more detailed surface appearing. If I look right in here, you can see it's still doing what are considered chords across that arc because surfaces don't have curves in them, but it's approximated by creating enough chords. And now if I look at these contours, they're much more concentric to the feature lines. Okay, really easy to work with in that way. Now if I need to create a spillway in here, it's quite easy to do. Maybe right over here on this end I can create a spillway out of my pond. You want to use elevation points when you don't want to change the geometry. PIs are for changing the geometry. Use elevation points when you just want a grade break changed. So I can pick this and I could snap right here, and it prompts me now that elevation is at 831. What if I want to go down to 829? And when I do that, you can see that change right over here in 3D. Now you can put in a couple others like this. One right here, set that to 831. One over here, 831. Okay, and you can start to generate a spillway. Now we're going to get back to the daylighting over here in a bit, but that's how you would kind of shape some of that spillway there. Now when you do that, if you run stepped offsets again to these feature lines, you're going to get the same result. You're going to get that same spillway in these feature lines, so you end up having to manage some of those points. Not a big deal, but easy to do. The other thing you can do is remove some here, back up. Okay, it's important to understand kind of the massaging of your feature lines as you work through your design. Now let's do one other thing with this pond, some other grading basics, and then we're going to move on to some complex more complex grading in the parking lot. We often want pond capacity. We certainly need that. There's a couple options here. On the design panel, there is a stage storage option. On the analyze in the design panel, there's stage storage that'll give you capacities at different levels. I'm going to show you a more basic option, which is just to create a volume surface. So I'm going to call this the top of pond, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this into a different surface. This is another empty surface. So feature lines can belong in multiple surfaces, not a problem at all. We're going to add this to the pond top surface. And we can call that the high water line. I'll go ahead and add this in. Okay. Now that's just a surface that's sitting flat at the top of my pond. Okay. Now from here I can create another surface through the volumes dashboard to compare that to my actual FG surface, and it'll give me my pond capacity. So this will be pond volume. We're going to compare the pond top surface with the FG surface. Now which you choose for what, it doesn't really make a difference for pond volumes. The number will just show up in the cut column versus the fill column. I hit OK. We see that show up right here. I'm getting a cubic feet of 1,035 cubic yards rather. Now all that's dynamic, so that if I say there's some more nuanced grading I want to do to this, the tool we'd want to use for, say we want to grab this end down here, we want to lower this portion of the bottom of the pond. Okay, and this case we want to use the quick elevation editor. So I can come in here, I can snap here. Instead of 826.13, maybe we want it 824.5. Same thing here, 824.5. Same thing here. Okay. And then maybe this one up here we want to drop down a little bit, 825.2. Okay. And as I'm doing that, you can see how it's adjusting in 3D there. And the volume surface as well, if you go and look at it in the volumes dashboard, it'll say out of date. You just click this refresh button, and now we have more pond capacity because I dropped the bottom down. Okay. So use that elevation editor tool. For mass editing, use quick elevation for point-by-point editing. When you add your break lines into your surface, be aware of the triangulation that happens. Don't do too much, otherwise your surface and your drawing gets really heavy and slow, but do enough so that the detail looks correct. Okay, those are some of the fundamentals. We'll use those over and over now as we move on to some more complex parts of our site. But I'm going to leave the pond like that, and we're going to tie into the parking lot as we move along. So let's talk about parking lot grading. Parking lot grading is a bit more complex, right? We can't just run stepped offsets from one feature line. We have all sorts of different curb islands and so on. And with all those curb islands, we have a lot of different vertices that all need different grades or different elevations. We end up with really what can be hundreds of vertices to manage across all of our curb lines. And what we're often after is something like some sheet drainage away from the building, maybe to slope towards the pond, a spillway or something like that. So I'm going to introduce the concept of a setup surface to help us manage all of these different vertices in a more efficient and kind of model-focused way. I'm going to turn on a layer here. I've got some of this set up for us. Just in the interest of time. What I have here are a set of feature lines. One is a perimeter feature line wrapping all the way around, and then the other ones are just connecting to different points along here. So how this works, you want to draw a feature line around the entire perimeter of your proposed curb vertices. So I left out this point right here where it's going to tie into existing, because that's pretty straightforward what those elevations should be. But the rest of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to control all the elevations from a surface built from these very simple feature lines. Okay? Now you can edit these as you see fit. Start out by drawing a polyline like we did a pond, and then start to envision where you'd have ridges or swales in your parking lot, and then draw crossing feature lines there. Another handy tool as you're grading this out is to use feature line labels, and I'm going to add some of them that I've got built into my template here. Add feature line labels to your feature line so you see what the grades are. I'm going to add them on here. Let's change our scale a little bit. Okay. And now you can see all the grades, and I get a sense of the elevations. Now let's talk about the building here. I brought this right up to the building, and my finished floor is going to be at 833 with an entrance right here. Okay. What these feature lines represent are the gutter line elevations, or the pavement elevations in our parking lot. And so, for that reason, I have this set a half a foot below the finished floor, because it's the gutter line elevations that will respond, or that we're grading right out here. We're going to go ahead and grab these feature lines. You can run a select similar here, very handy when you're working with a lot of different feature lines. And we're going to add those into the parking grid surface. We'll give it a simple name up here. I'll hit OK to add these into the surface. You can see this showing up in 3D over here. Okay. Now this is my preliminary drainage pattern, or my setup surface. And with these labels on here, the surface added, you can now get a very easy idea of what your drainage is going to look like. Now we're not concerned with every little elevation on every little curb island quite yet. We're trying to get the overall drainage pattern. Now where those curb islands are, obviously that plays into where we would draw these crossing grid lines. So you want to think about that as you put this together. Every project will be different. I'm just trying to show you a concept of it here. But now, picking this middle feature line here, if I run quick elevation edit, and I hover over this crossing gold-colored feature line, notice I hover on it and it says -1.5. That's what the label says. Okay, I can pick this. Let's set it to -2 instead. You'll see the contours respond right away to it. Okay, that's what we're after with this. Labels so we can see the different grades on our site. Okay, maybe this should be a little bit steeper right here. Actually, we can flatten it out a little bit. Let's do that. We're going to get some sheet drainage kind of over here where it could then flow in a catch basin, into a culvert, into our pond, or perhaps just a spillover curb. Okay. So play with this grading concept a little bit. Get some preliminary grades. You can even put a parking lot boundary around this and check initial earthworks if you want. But from here we're going to move on to grading our feature lines. And the feature lines we're after are these ones right here. They're polylines currently, and they represent the gutter line. And in fact, that's what they're tied into on the existing feature lines as well. It's always handy to have feature lines representing your existing grades as well. They could be survey figures as well. Same difference. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take these feature lines and we're going to assign them elevations from this surface. We're going to make those elevations relative to the surface, and we're also going to put those feature lines in the same site as the gold-colored grid lines. So a lot of object interaction going on there. I want to introduce a new concept here. It's called feature line style hierarchy. I mentioned it in the intro. If I want this grid surface and all these gold-colored lines to control the grading, I want to make sure that at those crossings that the gold lines always control, right? Now we said when we put two feature lines in the same site, they assume the same elevation. Okay? I want to make sure that the grid lines control. And how we do this is through something called like I just said, feature line style hierarchy, and you access it if you go into the site and then right-click on feature lines. If you go to the properties of the feature lines category and then the options tab, you'll have a list of all the styles in your drawing. This order from top down is the hierarchy I'm talking about. What it means is that when a feature line with this style and then another one with this style cross one another, this one will always control. That's the behavior we're after here. Okay, and I've got this set up already. My existing and my grid, those are the gold feature lines. My parent, those are going to be these red gutter lines. And then my child lines are going to be the offset feature lines I create from these. So I'm going to cancel out of this. We're going to go in and assign, create feature lines out of all these polylines. Another little trick here, run a select similar on all these polylines first, and then hit escape. Okay, now don't pick anything else on the screen. Go right to your feature lines from objects command, and then click P for previous in the command line, and it'll highlight all those things in the previous selection. Okay, now this is going to be added to the same site so that they interact with the grid lines, except the style is going to be parent like we said, so that when they cross one another it's always the grid lines that control. We basically want to stick this surface or these feature lines right to the surface. I'm going to assign elevations from the parking grid, and we're going to make it relative to the surface with a 0 offset. So I'm going to hit OK, and now you should see over here in the 3D view all those polylines are up here and they're draped on the surface. Let's expand this out a little bit more. Okay. Now relative to surface, what does that do? It controls just the vertices in the feature line. Okay. What it means is that if there's a dip in the surface right here, the red feature line won't pick that up. That's where the feature line style hierarchy comes into play. Let's go ahead and do that once. Let's take that example. If I zoom in right here, what if there was a low point right there? Let's go ahead and insert an elevation point on this grid line right here. It's prompting me, it's telling me it's at 833.7. Let's drop it down to 831 just to get some visual effect. I'll hit enter. You'll see the surface respond, but you're also going to see that red feature line. It's going to bend according to that feature line. And that's because they're touching. Right here, in fact, they're totally overlapping. If I pick on this feature line, you don't see a grip there. But if I actually open up Elevation Editor, what you'll see is something that I like to call phantom points. Civil 3D automatically put them in there. Now you can't edit them, but there's one right there, okay, and it shows up in this list, okay. So you want to understand that interaction, and you want to take advantage of it because it helps you build much more dynamic models in this way. Now if I back that out and I delete that point, watch what happens. Everything responds. Okay. Okay, now with the grading of these lines, if I pick this feature line, that was at a negative 2% before. If I click on this and now do a negative 1.5 again, watch that whole curb island respond to it. It moves up with it. Okay. So in this way we get all of our curbs moving with our grading surface, or my grid surface. And my grid surface is fairly simple to manage, right? So one of the things we're after with a grid surface is minimizing the number of feature lines and the number of vertices within them so that it's only so much to manage. But next stage, what I want to do next is to actually grade the curbs. I need to create tops and backs of curbs and so forth. And so the real common way to do that with Civil 3D is to run stepped offsets just like we did here. Some people run, there's options to run a corridor region around here. I've taught classes on that as well. I think it's a pretty clumsy workflow, in fact. I think this is easier to understand using just feature lines, but taking advantage of some of these things I'm after here. So running stepped offsets, we'd run through and run that on all of these different feature lines. It takes a little bit of time. It's not too bad though. But I also want to mention one other utility here. Many of you maybe already have access to it. And it's a tool called AutoGrader. It's in the CTC project suite. And if I run this, what it allows me to do is to automate all these stepped offsets. In fact, I have a family defined in here already. If I jump into here and I edit this family, what it is first a reference to a set of parent feature lines on a particular layer. There's 6 of them, in fact. That's all of these red feature lines. And then what I can do is I can spell out any number of offset feature lines row by row like this. So one here is the top of curb. It's a distance to relative elevation. Next one is the back of curb. That's going to attach to the top. And then appropriate parameters there. And then the flange or the lip will be on this side. It's going to offset to the right side with different parameters. If I look into the formatting tab, what I can do here is I can control the styles, the layers, and the sites of all these feature lines. So I'm going to assign a default style like this. And I'm going to put this in a different site. This is key here. This is a different site than what the grid lines are in, than what the curb gutter lines are in. And the reason is when I offset this, they're going to be at different elevations. If they're in the same site and they cross these grid lines, guess what's going to happen? It's going to pull that top of curb down 1/2 foot to be matching the pavement grades, and we don't want that. So we throw it in a different site in this way, and then it won't interact. I save out of here. I've got one other option here. I can set the surface that my feature line should be added to, and I can even control the break line settings. So I hit OK to this. Now I can click Run, and what you're going to see in the background here are a whole bunch of offset feature lines created for me automatically. Did the perimeter curb, and then it'll do the curb islands in here. And because of the surface settings, it's going to add everything to the surface as well. I'm going to close out of here. Now for simplicity's sake, I'm going to turn off my grid surface. Keep this a bit simpler. And now we're working with just our FG surface. Okay? So AutoGrader or stepped offset, you can use either one. AutoGrader will speed it up for you, but the same concept applies in the stepped offset workflow. It's just a bit more tedious for you. Now from here, right, I might make grading changes depending on how some of this looks. A slope analysis is a very handy tool. Let me show you that. If we go to slope analysis, I hit apply, you're going to see all kinds of slopes applied here. And if I go to the analysis tab, let's go to the actual slopes option here. And what I've done is I've added 3 different ranges. Okay, this stuff saves into your surface. From 0 to 1, it's going to flag slopes as red. That's too flat. From 4 to 5%, that's maybe too steep. So you could set this 3 to 5, whatever your design standards are. And then anything over 5%, it's way too steep. Okay, and when I hit OK, what I see out here is it tells me, okay, there's something too flat. There's a little steep, but maybe I'm okay with it. Okay, that's real steep, but that's in the pond. That's what I want. Okay, and as you make changes to this grading, it'll respond to. Let's set this back to a design with tin option. Okay, and let's move on. Okay. Now you've done some preliminary grading. Maybe you were able to use the grid surface for the majority of your grading and your parking lots. That's great. But oftentimes you need to kind of break from it and do more detailed grading in that way. It's not an issue at all, right? Initially these feature lines, we had them all in the same site as the grid feature lines. Okay, if you don't want it to interact with those anymore. You can grab all these feature lines and you can move them into a different site, and then they won't interact with the grid lines anymore. Okay? You can also pick these feature lines, like the gutter lines that we made relative to the surface. If you go into Elevation Editor, you can change the setting right in here from relative to surface to absolute elevation. Okay? So you can strip that link from it to move into some more final or detailed grading as you see fit. Let's move on to some miscellaneous grading, and with that I'm also going to freeze my grid lines here. So what are some other things we might do in here? Perhaps a rectangle for a grading pad in here. Let's drop that in. Maybe it's some picnic tables out here and it's a small pad. I'm just going to draw that as a polyline. We'll throw it on the building layer here, and then we'll create a feature line out of this. So this is a real common technique for a lot of miscellaneous features. Get some of the major components done, the parking lot and the pond, and for this stuff, put it in a none site so it doesn't interact with anything. Okay? Keep your default parent style, because this is one you want to be able to edit, and then assign elevations from FG. Okay, kind of like that pond where we pulled them from EG for starting elevations, but don't make it relative to FG. This way we can edit it after the fact. Okay, I can even throw some of those labels on there if I wanted to, or just go right into my quick elevation editor and set some grades on here. So that's at 834.08. From there we can go up at a 2%. And then from here, let's say this is going to go up at a 1%. Same on this side, up at a 1%. And that would make that a 2% as well. So some small sheet drainage off of there. Okay, you simply add that into the same FG surface. Give it a name to describe the break lines, and then those same supplementing factors to get decent triangulation. Okay. This is why we want to use all one surface, because it allows us to force that interaction or get that automated grading between, say, the back of curb here and this pad. Now, if there's a walkway here, run offsets from the back of curb, so on and so forth. Okay, it's all this kind of stuff repeating. What about the building grades here? I've got a polyline here. We're going to turn this into a feature line. We're going to set it to none for the site interaction again. I'm going to assign elevations. And I'm going to assign a flat elevation of 836, because that's what my finished floor is, and then we'll edit it from there. Okay? Now that comes up here. Now one thing to notice is these feature lines right over here where this loading dock is. Okay? We could do one of two things. We could have added this into the same site as these curb feature lines so that they cross and interact with one another, or we can simply set their elevations to match those curb feature lines. So I'm going to do that. So this curb is set at 835.3, so we can do the same thing for this one here. Better yet, let's add it to the same site. That'll give us some better interaction here. We'll add it into the building site. Hit OK. Okay. And then you might have seen that in 3D snap right down to those curb lines. Okay. Now from here I'm going to add this right into the surface, and then we can go ahead and continue to manipulate it as we see fit. This will be the building. Okay. Now some of these other elevations, this is the entrance right here, so we'd want to put some elevation points and set that at 836. Make sure that that entrance way is the way we want it to be. Okay, you can draw feature lines connecting this to the back of curb if you want. Okay, if this is to be a ped ramp here, we can insert more elevation points and flatten that curb. Now from here, we can kind of shape the grading as we see fit. Here's where the entrance is. From there, we want to go away at, say, see, that one's 8. That should have been 836, right? And then we can slope away at a slope, whatever slope we might want. Okay, and you kind of go around the building here, setting these as you see fit. So 834, I'm going to drop this back corner. So this represents the grading at the face of the building. Okay. So building grading is pretty straightforward. Just take the envelope, turn it into a feature line, think about how you want it to interact with some of the curbs that might come up to it, or walkways, and then throw it into the surface, and you'll be on your way. What about some other miscellaneous grading here, like tying into existing on this side of the site? Let's say we want to create a berm around the site here, and then from there daylight into existing grade. I'm going to take advantage of that kind of freehand polyline drawing I did before. We're going to connect right down here the existing curb, come up here, then I'm going to start drawing in how I want this berm to look around the site. Okay, it may not be a berm you're after, but there's a lot of different strategies here. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to snap right to the end point of where I want to match into the existing curb line, like what would be my grading limits there. And then we'll take this and we'll put it on our grading limits layer, and we'll turn it into a feature line. We're going to add to that same building site, hit OK, and then we're going to pull elevations from EG for a starting point, but we're not going to make it relative to it because we're going to raise up those elevations to create a berm. So right here we're tying into existing grade, and we can see that match in right there, and then I want it to kind of come up from there to create a berm of sorts. So there's a number of tools. I'm going to use another one here we mentioned in the intro, the set grade between points. Let's say I want to hold this elevation here. I click on it, it prompts me 833.2. Let's set it at 833.5. Okay, and then with this command, as I hover along my feature line, it highlights all these other vertices. So I can come all the way around to here, click this one, and now I can control all those elevations in between. So it's prompting for set grade. The current grade is at 0.16. Let's flatten that to 0. The whole top of our berm will be at a 0 grade. And in that way, what I end up with are flat grades all the way along the top of this. If I use this quick elevation editor, you can hover. You see I've got 0% there. Now one strategy, if you're not doing a berm, is you could take that, grab elevations from existing and throw it into your surface, and it would give you kind of a flexible daylighting or grading limits edge. Because I want to do the berm, I did it this way, and then I'm now going to target the existing surface. And there's two ways to do this. One is to use the grading creation tools, and when you do this you want to use the slope to surface. But when you're done with it, because they're so unstable, you can delete the grading object itself and be left with the resultant feature line that represents that targeting to the surface. I'm going to show you how to do it another way with AutoGrader, and in this way I can take my berm family here, and all I have to do here is pick my feature line. I've defined my grading here, which will be a slope to surface. It's going to go to the left, and it'll go at a 10%. I can also control the formatting in here. Put it on that same layer and in that same site. Okay. And we're also going to put it in the same surface. So I'm going to click Run to this. It's going to create a daylighting feature line, and it's also going to add that primary feature line right into the surface. Now that's not much of a berm. You can see it right here. So what we can do is we can bring that up a little bit. And this is the kind of processes you end up going through. You try some preliminary grades, then you move things around. I'm going to instead use this set elevation or grade to points. I'm going to pick this one again. Instead of 833.5, we're going to go to 835.5. We're going to come all the way around here to this point again. We're going to do a grade of 0%. Okay. And now it brings that feature line up. You can see that right here. If I come back to my auto grader and refresh that grading family, it'll refresh that 10% daylight slope. So I close out, and there we are. Okay, a few other things here. What about tying into the existing back here? Okay, we're going to be grading right up to this back curb. So if you have feature lines created, or if you don't, draw polylines, pull elevations from existing, we can take these and we can add them right into the same surface, the FG surface. This will be existing curb. Okay. And now that ties in right over here as well. If we want to punch a hole in our surface where the building is, okay, use that same feature line, but as an outer boundary. So pick your surface, you can go to boundaries, and this will be a building boundary. It's going to be a hide boundary. To trim outside, you do an outer boundary. We're going to do a hide boundary. I'm going to go pick that feature line, and then you'll see the triangulation eliminated from that part of our surface. Okay, and now everything I do to that feature line for the grading around the building, if I change the geometry of it, the boundary responds to it. So try to use the same feature line there. Okay. Now surface editing, we talked about an editing hierarchy of sorts. I'd said you always want to do break lines first, right? And then we want to do major edits. Those include things like boundaries. Once you've done all that and you have a pretty good 90+% complete grading, then you can concern yourself with little nuanced things like how some of the triangulation looks. Okay, perhaps down here we can shape some of this contouring a little bit, and that's right here in the swap edge. Okay, if I click this, I can shape how some of this looks a little bit. That's more preferred to you. Okay, some of that doesn't look too bad. Maybe right here we tweak it a little bit to make it look a little nicer. Okay, but by and large you shouldn't have to do much of that. If you think about your break line settings, right, those supplementing factors, when you add this in here, these break lines in, you're going to get really nice triangulation. So that's a lot of what I wanted to show you guys today. Just a few concluding comments here. Plan first and then grade. I threw a lot of different concepts at you. It's important to think about which ones apply to your current project, right? Plan it out. What am I going to do for the parking lot? What am I going to do for the pond? Maybe it's not a commercial site like that. Maybe it's lot grading, or it's landfills, or any number of kind of non-corridor type grading. Think about it first and then move on. And you want to strike a balance between flexible and dynamic. Like with that parking lot, we use that grid surface. It's very dynamic, but it's less flexible in that way. And in that way, I showed you how you can disconnect from that grid surface and move on to more detailed grading, to just be editing point by point if you wish. You always want to minimize the number of feature lines and vertices you have. It's just less to manage. It's less weight in the drawing. Your drawings perform better. And think about how those surfaces react to the feature lines. Those supplementing factors are a really key thing. It's kind of like the frequency setting in corridors. This is frequency for break lines. And finally, always edit at the source, which are your feature lines. Those are your grading components. You really want to minimize any editing to the surfaces. So with that, I want to thank all you guys for watching, and we'll go ahead and take questions live now. I'll respond to them in the Zoom system. Thanks again.